So welcome everyone to PoetryEast. I'm really delighted to have Colm Tóibín back to PoetryEast. He actually came to PoetryEast a few years ago. I was honoured to interview him about his novels, particularly in PoetryEast here at the London Buddhist Centre. And he's just released a new collection of poems, and I'm afraid I knew somebody was going to be going to one of his readings, so I got them to pounce on him and to snatch his email off him. We've all been there. But yes, I was thinking to myself before, what is it about Colm Tóibín's work that I love so much? And really, it comes down to he's really good company. And I don't know about you, but when I read a book, whether a work of classic literature or a modern novel, what I want is someone who's good company, who's emotional but not gushing and sentimental, who's intelligent but not clever, who's elegiac but not maudling, who can be funny but isn't stuck in that kind of trivial kind of silliness, who can move between modes. And especially I want an author who you feel is kind of reaching through time and space, sometimes across the centuries, to shake your hand. You feel like you've met the person through the novel. And I felt that very, very strongly reading Colm Tóibín's novel. I think I first actually read Love in a Dark Time. That was the first thing I read, which is a sequence of essays, which I loved. And you know that feeling when you just snatch the next book. I think the next one I read was The Heather Blazing, and I went from there to The Blackwater Lightship, and then to all of the novels. I've pretty much read all the novels. And of course, most recently, his wonderful novel about Thomas Mann, The Magician, which is like a diptych with his novel, The Master, which was one of my absolute all-time favorite novels. And of course, he's also written a wonderful short book on the American poet Elizabeth Bishop. If you've not read Bishop, and if you want an introduction to Bishop, you couldn't start at a better place than Colm Tóibín's short book about it. And now, just to top it all, just to make those of us, terribly stressed, he's also, not that I'm, anyway, he's also just published a collection of poems, his first collection of poems with Carcanet. So yeah, welcome, Colm. Really, really lovely to see you, even if it's virtually. Yeah, really nice to have you here. You're Zooming in, aren't you, from New York?
I am, yes.
So, of course, I write a bit myself, so I'm a bit jealous, Colm. I've never written a novel. I've written a bit of prose, and I have written poetry. So you've written, I think, 9 or is it 10 novels, something like that?
10, yeah. 10
yeah. Now, I thought so. Yeah, I think you've gone up to 10 with The Magician. You've written, a lot of, prose work. So obvious thing is, how come you started writing poetry? How come we've now got a collection of poetry from Carcanet here in the UK?
When I was 12, in the September, my father had died in July, and this is September. In our house, when you were that age, you were meant to go into a room on your own in the evening and study. And my siblings were very good at this, but I would go in on my own and I would try and study. But I found that really quite early of that month, I started to write poems, and I did that more or less every day, going on for years, really. And I went to boarding school, I did the same thing. So I was always writing poems, and I was always reading poems, and I was following poetry like somebody would follow sport. In other words, if there was a poem in the newspaper, I could cut it out and look at it, and I had favorite poets. And I was reading poets like Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, Robert Lowell, Seamus Heaney. And then I went to university, where for the first time, I found kindred spirits. And but that became very competitive. I was competitive for good reasons, in that some people were better at it than others. And I really just wasn't any good. I couldn't work out a way of relaxing my tone enough to write a poem that didn't seem like someone trying to write a poem. Obviously, Hopkins is a terrible influence on anyone, because you get this knotted, gnarled sound, and your poems are filled with, sort of angular words. And I couldn't connect a poem to my breath so that I could get a sound. And I was working with an iambic pentameter, but no sense of breath in that. I couldn't relax. I stopped. No one cared. There was no great mourning in Dublin. And I didn't do it again for 30 years, perhaps even a bit more. And after I published, or I sent the novel, The Master, which would be in 2003, I suppose, to be printed, I had been working so hard with printed words, for so long, making erasures, additions to the book, that out of that sort of living in language process, I began to write these very short poems. And over the next, say, 15 years, I would have written maybe 1.5 a year. They would come at the oddest times. I mean, more often at night than day. Often they were long, and then they were shortened down to maybe 6 lines. Some of them were quite abstract. Just the language pleased me. I let it go where it would, cut it back. Often I would go back every hour just to see if a word could be changed, what could be done. And then so that was fine. I published a few of them, but not many. And I prided myself on my fact that I wrote so little. I felt like some sort of Japanese poet, who was really minimalist and pure. And then I had cancer, and I was on steroids. And steroids are really amazing because they give you this grinding energy for about an hour a day. You can really have clarity, and you can. So I wrote a few poems under the auspices of steroids, and I published maybe 2 of them. And an editor at Carcanet, John McAuliffe, he's a poet, and he saw those poems and said, what else do you have? And I showed him what I had, and he was very nice. He was the first person had ever encouraged me, really. And then the pandemic began. Whatever that was like, I was in Los Angeles. I was in my boyfriend's house. The days were long. I mean, it was, the beautiful long Southern California day, beautiful mornings. And of course, there was nothing to do all day. He found book clubs and writers groups, and at 6 o'clock every day, he was busy with all these people, doing all those Zooming. And I was there. And I started to write really every day. And I revised. I would, what I would do is I would let the poem go anywhere it would. And often halfway down, something would begin. And it was very easy because you just go back every hour and you erase what doesn't work. And often what happens is if the poem isn't working after 2 days, let it go, because it's never going to work. You're going to have to try too hard. The problem is the original image wasn't right. That there was something you're trying to say that you don't know what it is. And it isn't, I mean, don't know what it is fine sometimes because you're just exploring and something comes. But I mean, where you literally think it's something, but it's really something else. And in that case, if the something else doesn't come halfway down, it won't come. Leave it, forget it. The original thinking or the original feeling has been flawed in some way. And sometimes what I was trying to do was to not overuse metaphor and not overuse simile, to try and get openings of poems that would fulfill something that you might, not that you might say, although it had to be connected to speech. And not that it was obvious breathing, but it had to be connected to breath. So that a poem like Because the Night would open, not sleeping, and then a night's hard sleep. And notice there's nothing in that. I mean, it's just simply a fact, not sleeping, and then a night's hard sleep. But I think when you get to my age, it does happen where one night you just go absolutely into oblivion, whereas the other nights you're having trouble. And so some poems, I mean, a poem called Jericho will begin, the sky at night is full of stars that outshine the moon. And again, just notice even no adjectives. And so that was the effort was, I mean, there's a poem called Tiepolo about the painter, which just goes, the main one, the father, more than anything, loved the pale blue sky. And just all the time, just trying to get an ease into the tone that's not about a poet striving to write a poem, but someone trying to say something that's true. And so that's really the effort. You know, in other words, I was trying to get 2 lines about having cancer, and just the first 2 lines are no dreams or anything like that. And so oddly enough, these openings gave me a lot of energy in that I've just said something true. Now continue with that, and don't hold your breath, but breathe, and let the sound of the breath into the thing. Anyway, that was the That was what I started to do. And I would sometimes really be ruthless with a poem. Like if only 4 lines worked, just extract those 4 lines and and just go with them. There's no need for a poem to be long, but some of them are quite long.
Yeah,
That's because I kept letting them go to see where they might take me.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, we're going to come back to quite a few of those poems in a moment. But before we come to that, I was remembering when we met before, Colm, that you talked about your mother and how she used to remember whole sections of Shakespeare and repeat them as she was going around the house. I thought it'd be nice to hear about, and when you came here, I was struck by you were one of the very few readers who started not with reading your novel. I think it was the Testament of Mary that you were launching here. You started with reading a Rilke poem, and you started with another poem, I think. So perhaps say a little bit about poetry in your life. I mean, it seems to me that you only have to be Irish, and poetry is in your blood, never mind in your life. But
yeah, but oddly enough, that's just not true. There are a lot of Irish people who really have no interest in poetry. But yeah, my mother left. By the way, the painting on the cover of the book is by my mother. My mother left. Yeah, that's a painting of Vinegar Hill, which is the hill opposite us in the town of Enniscorthy. That's by my mother. My mother left school at 14, and like a lot of people that happened to, she loved learning. She loved books, and all her life she was finding new poets, and she wrote poems before she married, and then she didn't write again. But what's strange, towards the end of her life, she found a poet like Wallace Stevens. She just found it in the library.
Wow.
And she liked it. Then she found, and she became really interested in him. So she would do that in a small town on her own. She didn't have any friends who were doing that. And she would say to me, I found this by Wallace Stevens. And, she would read anthologies, and if something appealed to her, she'd go to the library and see if there was anything more by that poet. But I mean, she had seen a lot of those productions of Shakespeare that toured Ireland in this was 40s. And she had, she loved Othello and Antony and Cleopatra. And she would quote the oddest things. I was coming out of Paddington Station, going to Cheltenham with the Irish writer Sebastian Barry. I just noticed that that he checked something on his laptop, so we had internet connection, or he did, and something came into my head. It hadn't been in my head for years, maybe, I don't know, 50 years more, and it was and that must be how the big things pass and the little things remain, like the smell of the wattle in Lichtenberg, somewhere, I don't know, in the rain. I said to Sebastian, could you Google that for me? That must be why the big things pass and the little things remain, like the smell of the wattle in Lichtenberg. Just Google that and see. And there it was. It's a poem by Kipling. And we both looked at it, and that must be why the big things pass and the little things remain. And in a way, that's a sort of mantra you could use for writing fiction. That you need to go into the intimate detail, into the small thing, and see where that will lead you. But if you keep trying for the big things, that everything will elude you. You lose things. But she would move across the kitchen, just saying to herself, and that must be why the big things pass and the little things remain. And what it is the next line is like the smell of the wattle in Lichtenberg, riding in the rain. And it was a Kipling's poems to be in the voices of soldiers in the empire. And this was one in South Africa, who was in a place called Lichtenberg in South Africa. And so he was a soldier in Lichtenberg. And Kipling good old Kipling, he gave him a wonderful thought, the soldier. Instead of thinking about military things, that must be why the big things pass and the little things remain.
Yeah, I remember that so vividly when you were here talking about your mother, reciting great chunks of Shakespeare and reciting things. But listen, let's jump into one of your poems, because there's a lovely little quatrain, Cush Gap, 2007. I don't know why I wanted to start with it. I should say that I've had the temerity to, select a selection of Colm's work rather than.
Well, thanks for doing this. This is a house on the edge of the sea in Ireland. It's a new house, or it was in 2007 when I wrote this. Cushgap 2007. All night the sea wind makes clear its deep antipathy to this house, whose foundations I will steer tomorrow on a different course. So it's the idea of a house of a ship. The house is a ship that you could steer it away from the wind so that it would be protected in some better way.
Why don't you read it again? Because it's so short. It needs it needs 2 runnings at least, doesn't it?
Cushgap 2007. All night the sea wind makes clear its deep antipathy to this house, whose foundations I will steer tomorrow on a different course.
Lovely. It reminds me a bit of those quatrains by Derek Mahan. Not Derek Mahan, sorry. Derek Mahan.
Certainly Derek would have written about sea wind, and he had a lovely, elegant way of forming a stanza and letting the rhyme seem absolutely natural, but actually be there. So I should pay more attention to him. I mean, he was really a wonderful poet.
Also of Michael Longley, he's often writes 4-line quatrains like that.
Especially in recent poems. And what Longley has done, I think, in the last maybe 5 volumes, is find this very relaxed tone where you barely can hear a meter.
Yes,
and it is closer to breath. It seems natural, and yet there's a sort of shivering feel to the thing at the end. I think Michael Longley does that really well. Yeah.
He's kind of the master of the light touch, isn't he? He always seems to be. Yeah. You think, I should be able to do that, and then you try it, and it's much more difficult.
Yeah, it obviously requires a sort of a lifetime's work. But of course, he's been fascinated by Japan. I always feel that's made a real difference to him. That it's sort of he's found a sort of calm, minimalist tone that I think we all should try and find.
Yeah. Of course, I wanted to sort of say something about that house because I don't know Kush, I don't know Ireland. I've only been once, I think. But your novels, particularly, they evoke that world. I wonder whether you want to say a little bit about you and the sea and a house by the sea and Kush. And, I mean, that's so much of you, isn't it? You're such a man of place, it seems to me.
Yeah, my father was a teacher, which meant we had longer holidays in the summer, and so we would rent a place along that coast, which is County Wexford. So it's East Coast Ireland, meaning that the waves are very gentle. There are no rocks. It's eroding. The cliffs are eroding. It's a thing called marl, which is very soft clay, and so, I mean, my mother would go there, her sister, they'd all rent different houses. And so there'd be a big gang would go down to the beach. If there was any chance of sunshine in July, August, they'd go down, carry cots, transistor radios, rugs, and the sea was very safe, and but it was cold. And we didn't really go there again after my father died. So it became a place associated for me with freedom of the summer and also of loss. And then I went back there to, where I built a house there. And it's really in a lot of the novels. I mean, it's not in the Thomas Mann or the Henry James novels, but it's in all the Irish novels. I mean, the novels are not set in Ireland, they're set there. And it's emphatically, you see, there's a network of old lanes that are still there. I mean, most of them are still there. A few of them are slowly becoming overgrown, but there's a network of lanes. So it looks sometimes like a 19th century landscape. And you feel electrification was recent. And of course, it's the same families are living there. So you often see a grandson and you recognize him from his grandfather, by the face. And of course, people are very polite. And so it's, it's just that tiny little stretch of coast. I'm talking about a mile or so of coast. So that's all really.
I mean, that coast, I don't know, for me, it's emblematic of so many of the novels that I've come to love. There's that lovely moment in Brooklyn where they go down to the sea and they go, she's learned to put your bathing suit on because she's been to America. She's learned that you put your bathing suit on under your clothes. I remember learning that,
I remember learning that in Spain. The problem in Ireland is you can't really do it because your bathing suit doesn't dry. Because there's no drying, so you'd end up having to put your clothes on with that wet beneath you. Whereas in Spain, it would just dry in 5 minutes, of course, in the heat of August in Coney Island, it would do the same. So it's, but when I saw it in Spain first, I couldn't believe it. It seemed so elegant.
Yeah, right. But let's carry on with Wexford and go. I thought it'd be lovely to hear your poem Kennedy in Wexford. Sure, there's more that we could explore about the quatrain, but let's go to Kennedy in Wexford and hear more about you as a child again.
Okay. Kennedy in Wexford. There has always been a rumor that the local bishop died the day before Kennedy came to Wexford in June 1963. There was a feeling rightly that the death would put a damper on the whole occasion. People might mourn the bishop or praise the president, but they could hardly do both on the same day. So the announcement of the death was postponed until Kennedy had left. A good few must have known, but they kept quiet on the matter. I've often wondered if the very prospect of the visit did not in fact kill the bishop. Perhaps it affected his nervous system or froze his heart. In any case, he lay there undead and unalive, virtual, his episcopal soul in suspension, like Schrodinger's cat. Until Kennedy had waved at us all and departed. Unlike Kennedy, the bishop was a good living, pious man. He wrote a pamphlet on the Christian home and caused no fuss until his untimely death. So once the coast was clear, you can be sure he went straight to heaven. Yet despite all this, I believe that if people had been asked to choose between a dead bishop and a live president, they would have opted for the latter. I was only 8, but I too would have cheered for Kennedy. I'd been taken out of school and liked excitement. We stood on the quays and waited for his car and went home with news of his suntan and his teeth.
I really like that last line. I went home with news of his suntan and his teeth.
Well, we hadn't seen anything like it. I mean, it was all completely new.
Yeah, you certainly noticed how wonderful American teeth are.
Yeah, but I think he was very brown, his skin. I think there was some actual illness causing it. But you see, a lot of us Irish people, we went red in the sun.
Right. Yeah.
And then the skin would peel. So the idea of ever going brown, I mean, it didn't exist, the concept, because of people having very fair skin. Whereas Kennedy really looked so glamorous. And the fact that, you see, he wasn't with Jackie. Jackie didn't travel with him. His sisters did. But he looked even more glamorous without her. If he'd been with her, everyone would have just looked at her.
Right, yes, yeah. And, you know, is that a true story? I mean...
Oh, yeah. As far as I understand, it's always been said. If you look at the dates, I mean, you look up the dates, yes, that's correct. So it was always a rumor. And I just thought, well, it should be in a poem, really, because it's this idea that he was nearly dead that day, but then he was, you know, then, I mean, what would you do if you were his, you know, just wait till Kennedy goes. Keep him in a state of undeadness for a few hours, basically.
Yeah, of course.
I don't see any harm in it, really.
No, not at all. No, and I just, you know, I'm wondering, you know, what faith has meant to you. You know, even though I don't get a sense of an explicit faith, all the way through the novels and the poetry, well, there's a sense of something more, is there not?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'm talking about ideas of spirit, of trying to realize that the material world, the world of things, doesn't matter sometimes when something else matters, and the something else is something that's very, very hard to name, and for me, it could manifest itself in music or in poetry, or even in just the way light comes into a room. And if you just take light comes into a room, then you try and get a phrase for that. You open a poem with it. So you're moving into a realm that is really non-material all the time. But I wouldn't push it any further than that.
Right. Yeah. You don't feel you were presumably were raised as a Catholic.
Oh, I was. I mean, I was little Catholic altar boy, and
right. Yeah.
My hands were always joined, and I know all the prayers. And,
right. Yeah.
I mean, I do think like on Sunday, which was Easter Sunday. I mean, I've listened to the whole of Bach's St. Matthew's Passion.
Right.
So I'm sort of I'm sort of locked into the rituals in some way or other.
The other thing I wanted to ask is not so much in this poem, but it's certainly in many of the novels, nearly all of them, is this sorrowing sense that that, you know, personally I really value. It's interesting. I've been reading the Ian McGilchrist. I don't know whether we're going to be interviewing him soon. And he was saying he fears that we're losing touch with sorrow. That you know, culture is becoming less and less sorrowing and more indignant and you know, and annoyed. I wonder whether you could say something about the sorrowing in your novels and in the poems. It's always feels there as a part of your world. I don't know whether that's true.
Yeah, I remember someone saying to me, I mean, I bumped into someone I knew, I didn't know her well, but her husband had died, and I just said I was very sorry that he died. And how was she? And she said something very beautiful. She said, I'm fine. You know, it's really a question of the mouse sorrow and the rat grief.
Huh.
And she looked at me, you know, and meaning that the mouse sorrow was fine. She could handle the mouse sorrow. It was the rat grief. And yeah, I think that I'm writing a novel at the moment, and I'm realizing it's the first novel I will ever have written in which no one dies. So that's 10 books in which I'm just circling and circling like a bird almost, you know. The idea of loss, the idea of a you know, an idea that we had once in our house, you know, a Christmas, say, in which there were 15 to 20 people, and that slowly over the years, in the strangest ways, that was whittled down to very few.
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes there would be no death for 5 years, and then a surprising one. You know, and it was you know, it would really affect me, because I would think, well, you know, imagine if we were back with the big crowd at the event. None of us knew what was coming, and it's so sad that someone's gone.
Yeah, cool.
We won't hear their voice again. So that has made its way into the books in all sorts of ways. Yeah, it's actually fundamental. It's actually maybe the only thing.
Yeah,
you know, that there isn't really anything else. That the landscape I'm describing is infused with that. The whole idea of human relations are infused with loss, the possibility of loss that has occurred. Someone is alone; they're alone with that loss. So yeah, it's at the very center, and there probably isn't anything else at the very center.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because, you know, again, McGilchrist is saying that sorrow is the human, really. You know, or Wallace Stephen would call us this diminished thing, which I really love.
Yeah,
you know.
Yeah, the mouse sorrow, the rat grief.
The other thing, just touching on to the new novel you're writing, but one thing that struck me about The Magician, I've been trying to promise myself not to talk about The Magician because we could go right off piste here, but one of the striking things about it is I felt there was more humour in it as well.
With the dialogue, the fact that, you see, if you didn't do that, you were getting a sort of Germanic sound in the novel and the dialogue, which would make people, you know, it would be heavy. And I thought that, look, this is the 1920s. These children are incredibly smart. How are they going to speak? They're going to interrupt each other. It's all going to be clipped, brisk, witty, and moving towards aphorism. So that any time there's dialogue in the book, the dialogue is very, very sharp and snappy in a way you don't associate with Germans.
There's this lovely mixture of the comic and the sad, you know, like in The Magician, you go, it's really a history of Germany from a particular view. It feels like a diptych, as I said, with the master, in a different key, in a slightly lighter key.
That's correct. Yeah,
something like that. And you've in that poem we've just heard, you got this mixing of the sorrow and humour.
That I was trying to, with the poems, I was trying to find a sort of lightness of tone where I wasn't going to go into the sort of unnecessary brooding that would, I think, mar the poem by being, I think Elizabeth Bishop said something very clever about, it's very important that emotion doesn't exceed its cause.
Yes,
I think that she's talking about sentimentality, but if you just leave the word sentimentality out and just say the emotion in the poem should not exceed its cause. And often you say in writing a poem, is this true? I mean, not factually true, but is it an exaggeration of feeling? I might say I was overwhelmed by something. No, overwhelmed is not the word here. Overwhelmed, first of all, it's a vague word, but secondly, it's an exaggerated word. is there something true that you felt that you could say? And, so you keep working towards moving inwards and inwards towards, if that word is not exactly right, it will go immediately. And if you're trying to think about how to replace it, don't think about words, think about feelings, and go back to the image, go back to the initial thing that inspired the poem, and just conjure it up again and see if that would give you the word, but not look for the word by looking for the word, but would go back to the thing almost.
Yeah, I see. Yeah, of course. Let's jump in again with another poem. I chose this poem 2 or 3. It's in two sections. A very different tone to Kennedy.
Yeah. It's about St. Anne's Church in Dawson Street on Sunday afternoon at 3:00. We do usually a Bach concert, and often conducted by John Beckett, who was a cousin of Samuel Beckett.
Wow.
And he was a minimalist conductor. He just did this with his hand, really. And he gave a little lecture beforehand, which was very pithy and laconic. And often he would work with the contralto, Bernadette Greevy, who really should have been famous worldwide, but she wanted to have a family and stay in Dublin. And I mean, she did some touring, and there are a few sensationally good CDs of her, Bernadette Greevy, singing Bach and singing Handel. But she was a great figure in Dublin. She's the most glamorous person, but the voice was a sort of mezzo leading towards contralto. And so I'm sort of thinking about that time and that world. And it's called 2 or 3. No matter how old I grow, the verger at St. Anne's stays the same. He's walking along Baggot Street, going home. Most of the singers and players from that time are dead. Most of the audience even. On Sunday afternoons in spring or late winter, we were among the youngest at those concerts. Before the hour changed, Dublin was almost dark by 4:30. 2 of them shadow me still. John Beckett, who began by introducing each cantata, his tone brisk, his way of conducting almost factual. Later, I read that he disliked Handel. And Bernadette Greevy's mezzo voice goes vai dry, where Samuel sinned. This was Dublin then. The music gathered up the pale light from outside. By the time the concert was over, darkness had mostly fallen.
By the time the concert had finished, darkness had mostly fallen. I like that, mostly fallen.
Mostly fallen.
I wonder whether this is I want to talk to you a little bit there about music, because music is obviously a passion of yours. But before we get to that, I wonder whether this might be time to talk about what poets you might be influenced by or particularly love, if that's a better way of putting it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that writing the book about Elizabeth Bishop was a great help, because she gave me various ways of describing loss without having to mention it, or describing landscapes where you were trying to be accurate about what they actually looked like, and that thing about feelings. I think that Derek Mahon, you mentioned, was very good at being ironic, being low-key, and then actually realized that the sort of levels of feeling in the thing were very high. But I suppose there were also 16th century poets like Thomas Campion, like Fulk Greville, who doesn't get it, and of course Tom Gunn in the 20th century. So that those sort of poets who were not exactly, I mean, Tom Gunn was a formalist sometimes, but he could loosen up his diction other times. And but I mean, and obviously with, you know, Yeats is always there, but you know, there was a big struggle in Ireland against Yeats, against his extraordinary addiction to symbolizing experience, to find that with everything, moving it beyond itself so that it meant something more. So that in the 50s, the Irish poet Patrick Kavanagh said about actually describing life, where the words simply were not metaphors, where they described the thing, and he left it at that. And those poems of Kavanagh's have had an enormous influence on everybody really in Ireland, and on Seamus Heaney and on everybody else since. But I also worked in Stanford with the poet Ivan Boland.
Oh yes, yeah,
and again, Ivan we had a marvelous time talking poetry, like you would, just finding a kindred spirit. And in those years, I had a few encounters with the poet, which Ivan had introduced me to, who's Louise Glick.
Oh
who
yeah,
actually won the Nobel Prize eventually.
Yes,
but
that's right.
There's a marvelous intimacy. I mean, it's very strange that she's won the Nobel Prize, and it's marvelous because the poems are not public poems. They're not poems of hope, of easy hope. They're very dark, desolate, intimate poems about what it's like to be her. I mean, I think they speak to a lot of people, but in a very intimate, whispering way. And it's marvelous she's been recognized in that way. But certainly there are poems by her, especially included in a book called The Wild Iris.
Yes, that's my favorite collection of hers.
Yeah, it sounds absolutely marvelous. The sense of struggle in that. She told me that she was silent. I mean, she wasn't writing for a few years and there's nothing coming, but all the time she had an image of a door, that there was a door, there was a door, there was a door, but she had no idea where that would go. There was a door. And it's a lovely idea. I couldn't believe she was telling me this, because of course, when she gets it eventually at the end of my suffering, there was a door. Yeah. You mean that was those words came before the iris, before nature, before anything? No, she said, yeah, just in my mind constantly, there was a door. Isn't it the most beautiful idea?
Yeah, indeed. It's interesting you mentioned Tom Gunn as well, because Gunn is a wonderful poet. And a gay poet. How is your sexuality? I don't know how is being gay has that affected you as a writer, as a poet? That's an absurd question, I know.
No, it's not. No, it's absolutely not. Because you have to. I got worried at one point in the book that I wasn't writing enough about it. And so I wrote a sort of filthy little poem called Gellert Baths, just about a sexual experience I had almost more than 30 years ago. But there are times when you just, the joke I make is that I'm often working so hard and thinking so hard about something that I forget I'm gay. And, someone then reminds me, oh my God, I'm gay. Maybe I should do something about it and write something about it or say something about it. I should look gay or something. And, it's a very good question, because there are so many other things going on that I really should put more thought into being gay. But then I try and then I don't, and I fail. And I should really become much more, gay. But I don't know. But then I would get bored being gay, and I would.
I really like it.
It doesn't mean I'd want to be straight or anything. I mean that.
No, I know what you mean.
The opposite to being gay is just thinking about something else.
Yeah. Well, that's what I mean. One of the reasons I came to love your novels so much is that I thought they were the first gay novels that weren't gay. If you see what I mean. I thought that's what we were trying to get to.
But I get worried sometimes, and I think I should write a big gay short story, and then I do write that, and then I feel I've contributed my little bit to the cause.
Well, you've written two at least two wonderful gay short stories. A long story, but
and then I go back to being a sad boy again.
Let's move. I mean, I'll distract myself if I'm not careful. So let's go to this poem, December. And the tones of the poem start to get colder, not colder, but sort of chill a bit in that particular way. So let's look at that. And
I think the order of the book, which John McAuliffe really did in Carcanet, is really good, because it actually, you think everything is going great and there are jokes and there are things, and then suddenly you go into these sets of poems, which really are quite dark, including this one. It's called December. I wondered that December day what I would miss. December light, the air liquid and grey, an hour before the ambiguous hour. Time when the mind's half filled with dreams, the gift of pure dazzling consciousness. Some books and music not to be heard again. The touch of flesh, your hand. When I first heard talk of death, I was 8, just in from school. My mother, staring in the mirror, said that my father would die, and soon he did. From then I did not put my trust in anything much. When I summon up the names of ones I love, for example, I recoil at having to whisper what has remained unsaid.
Can you say something about that?
I mean, it's about having cancer. It's about, just the whole idea of doctors coming in and out of the room, and they're very, very careful not to reassure you in a way that's false. So you're watching them for a sign of what actually it is they're saying. And so they leave the room and you're there and you're going over what they've just been saying. And no one is telling you there's 100% guarantee that you're going to be okay. And because they're not saying that, then they've opened up a lot of space where you start thinking about, that you wouldn't, there would come a time when you'll hear your last piece of music. You touch someone's hand at last time. So yeah, that's what that's about.
I mean, that's so strong, and then it echoes back to your father's death, which is an event that seems to that echoes through your life and through your writing. When you read your biography, you're very struck. I'm very struck by in fact, your parents. The reader comes to love as well, and I could almost recognize your father in the street. It feels like sometimes. Perhaps say a little bit about that, and this sentence, that line that you say, "I did not put my trust in anything anymore."
Yeah, I think that it's something that people who have suffered loss as children will talk about. I was really shocked when I met the first person who said to me, in the year after her mother had died suddenly, I dropped all my friends. I went back to school aged, 12, 13, but I didn't want to see those people anymore. And I isolated myself. I didn't even know I was doing that. When she said that, I thought, oh, that's what I did. I didn't know that was a syndrome. I didn't know that was part of what, and so that's what I'm writing about. I mean, it's a very odd, I suppose, piece of, the sort of neurosis that occurs out of loss.
But also, meaning comes out of loss, doesn't it? So often, I mean, you wouldn't want it, and yet.
Yeah, but I'm not writing about that here. It's where, just things get snarled. That you think you're going on as normal, and then it's only years later looking back on it, you realize nothing you did was normal.
Right. Yeah.
But no one told you, and you didn't know.
Indeed. I'd like, if we can, to explore this poem, Eccles Street. In fact, I've suggested 3 sections of it because it feels like it runs on very immediately from December. Why don't we let's just read the 3 sections? Let's get you to read the 3 sections.
So sections. Which are the 3 sections?
Well, I put 1, 3, and 6. That was
perfect. That's perfect. I need to explain that 7 Eccles Street was the house where Leopold Bloom in Ulysses, the fictional character, lived. And that house was knocked down in the 60s. Amazingly, that it was allowed to be destroyed. And the entire block was replaced by a private hospital owned by the Mercy Nuns. And it's a very good hospital. And this is where I was when I had cancer, in the same space as Leopold Bloom.
Wow.
So I'm going to read sections 1, 3, and 6.
Yeah.
Eccles Street. No dreams or anything like that. Sharp listening for sounds in the corridor, night noises. I'm awake when the oncologist visits between 6 and 7. When he leaves, anything at all swims into the room. A marinade I never had. Someone from UCD I'd half forgotten. A poem by Thomas Campion, Monteverdi's Beatus Vir. If the chemo zaps the tumor and doesn't kill me, I'm going to have an exemplary morning. I will make you breakfast in bed, toast and slices of liver with grilled mutton, kidneys and tea. I will go around the corner to the shop in Dorset Street, and when I come back, I will pick up letters from the floor that have just been delivered. And in the day ahead, the epic day will begin. In the dream world, there is a funeral and a walk up Westland Row. I could easily lose my own keys if the steroids were not thumping through me, causing me by the afternoon to forget nothing. What would it mean to go into the National Library, where the same readers are at the same desks since 1973? Or so I see as I look around. Funny how resonant the sound of the turning on and off of the little light switch on each desk in the library becomes in this hospital room without resonant sound. Why has that little snap sound grown to be what is holding me together as the juice flows? That thing about the breakfast in bed and the kidneys and liver is from Ulysses, is episode 4, where Leopold Bloom brings Molly her breakfast in bed, and he cooks for himself. He cooks liver and kidneys, so that's all from that. And also he goes around the corner. He goes around the corner to the shop in Dorset Street, and so all those things. And he's in the National Library, so that all those things are things that Leopold Bloom's doing. That in my sort of half hallucination, it's not exactly hallucination, but it's sort of just dreaming about the Blooms, comes into my head as I'm sort of lying in bed in this hospital.
I took all that. Excuse me. I took all that to be sort of autobiographical.
No, it's autobiographical in that I begin to imagine myself as Leopold Bloom.
And sorry, I've got a bit of a frog in my throat. I mean, of course, I really love that start. No dreams or anything like that.
Yeah, in other words, this is about chemotherapy. You know, this is about the sort of, you see, you're on steroids, but you're also on sleeping pills. And so whatever sleep you get is an hour of very deep, dark sleep. It isn't as though you get a night's sleep. You don't. And so there's a lot of edginess in the experience.
And did writing help?
No, I know, because I mean, I wrote 2 or 3 poems under the steroids, but for about 6 months, you have nothing. You have no, you can't listen to, strangely, you can't listen to music. It sounds like jumbled confusion, the music does. And you want to turn it off immediately. It is not to be listened to. You can't eat, you can't sleep, you can't drink, and you can't really walk, you know. And so you're really, I mean, the whole point of it is to reduce your entire system to zero so that the tumor itself will be reduced to zero. It's a most extraordinary idea that it's based on the idea of poisoning the system sufficiently. But of course, the system responds by making you feel grotesque. Your hair all falls out and you feel awful.
And how did you manage through that, as it were?
I just, you don't have any choice. So it isn't as though, this talk about battle against cancer is pure nonsense. You just get through the next 5 minutes, and then another 5 minutes comes. It seems impossible that you're going to be able to have to feel like this sort of level of anguish for the rest of the day. But if you do it 5 minutes at a time, and then time moves on, but it's you just lie there and see what happens. There's no battle involved. You know, the people in the kitchen are working harder than you are in the hospital, trying to make you food that you might be able to eat, but you can just usually eat nothing.
I mean, in this poem, which is one of the strongest poems, I think, of the collection, you know, there's also these people, the visitors in the next bay, or did you get a sense of a common world of?
No,
I mean, it's impossible.
I mean, it was one of those places where there was a corridor and everyone had their own room, and you didn't know who was in the room. But in the next room to me, there was a guy who was obviously in a heavy metal band, which of course is the last thing strikes you, expecting old and frail people, but that's not what cancer is. And so I saw it, I mean, really saw it, because I was always keep my door open to see what was going on in the corridor. And these big fat guys, you know, heavy metal guys with beards and bellies, and like they came by in groups, you know, to see their friend. And one Sunday they got permission to play music. And of course, people think about music as being soothing and soft and comforting. They played heavy metal, electric guitar, in an oncology ward. They had permission for it. I mean, nurse came in and said they had permission for that, just, you know, to do it for an hour just because that's what the guy wants. And I thought, what a very sweet thing to do, and what an unlikely thing.
Yes,
to have a heavy metal band playing in Dodgy Water.
Yes. And I mean, I don't want to pry, but it's an impossible question to avoid. But how are you now?
I'm good. I mean, I've had let me think. I'm 3.5 years, 3.5 years since, and I do it, one of those scans every 6 months. It seems to have done the trick. But I mean, you go on for 10 years where you do the test every 6 months. But so far it's been fine. It's been absolutely hasn't reappeared.
And has that fact changed your writing or deep?
No, I don't think it's done anything. It was just really boring, and it was over. And I think, I mean, maybe it's a way of just avoiding the truth. But I think if you have to wait for cancer to make you appreciate life, I think there's something wrong with you. It's but I didn't think I learned anything much from it, actually. I just wanted it to be over so I could get on with things.
It's too easy, isn't it, to say that one learns things from these things.
I think it is.
We'd like to learn from all sorts of things, but we usually learn from the most unlikely, most unlikely places, don't we?
I think that's true.
Let's go on to Canal Water, which is another poem, which again a change of tone. I sort of want to almost talk to you about dreaming, because dreaming, I don't know, I suppose dreaming is close to writing. It's very, very close to poetry, isn't it? Dreaming. It's the everyday person's poem, isn't it? A dream.
And I have to remember that dreams come in images, and it isn't just that a dream is dreamy. A dream is often very precise and exact and strange, but it's dreams have a lot of architecture in them, And there's a guy called Frederick Jameson, and he's a famous literary critic and philosopher. And he said, I thought it was an extraordinary thing to say, that we as people have we have a truer version of what the end of the world will be like than the end of capitalism. That we don't have any images for what the end of capitalism would look like, but we sort of have an apocalyptic vision of what the end of the world will be. And I just thought that was a wonderful idea. And I also wanted to put the word capitalism into a poem, because I think that, that it's a very hard word to get into a poem, because like capitalism, like how do you scan it? What do you do with it? But I thought if poems can't have the word capitalism, then they're poorer for that, And anyway, this is called Canal Water. I'm in Venice, dreaming of what it was like when painters knew which way to turn when they had need for commissions or when they sought salvation. There is fog in the morning to cloud our spirits, and then sunlight. In Venice, faces in paintings are alive with need, not just the main players, but the others who stood by, hardly caring who preached sermons, who lived, or who died. They were busy, these figures at the edges, and did not often think about redemption, much less about salvation. Their faces then and ours now look as though we are meant, in fact, for commerce, working out margins, rates of return. It is harder, as the man said, to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world. We hunger, however, for glare and splash, an opening of the spirit, the urgent end of anything at all. In the meantime, I'm waiting for a boat to take me to the sanctity of the Salute. The engine of the Vaporetto is grinding towards a silence like the very first one, to be broken only when the end of capitalism and the end of the world appear on the water, pursued by the panting populace, the first laden down with contracts, antitrust laws, overdraft statements, old software, the second filled up with painters in possession of the new colors that will be used to render finality in all its garishness. They join forces under the domed sky as the Giudecca and the Grand Canal meet close to where I stand and flow into each other, drink from the waters of the exemplary lagoon.
I mean, first of all, I wanted you to say something about Venice, because I remember reading something in the little section by you in the LRB about being in Venice during lockdown, I think it was.
Yeah, what was strange was for a period, everything was open in Venice in the pandemic, the churches and the museums. But there were no tourists because really the chances of getting in, because you had to have people were just getting used to PCR and antigen, all those things were beginning, but it was very hard to get into Italy. But there was a window, and I went in and I got an Airbnb, and you could still eat outside. It was October, so didn't take any risks about restaurants, and just walked and walked and walked. Only the Venetians were there, which meant that a lot of the time some things were completely empty. The Venetians don't use Piazza San Marco. It isn't. There's no desire path. It's not as though it's a square you would use to get from one place to another. There are much better ways to do that. So that meant that Piazza San Marco was, all the time I was there, entirely empty.
Gosh.
This place is so filled with people and pigeons and bands and noise and tourism and Japanese people with flags, so that people won't get lost. And it's such a busy place. And of course, Napoleon called it the greatest drawing room in Europe, and it always helps, that sort of phrase. And the beautiful Byzantine church. And you could get on a Vaporetto, and there would be no one on it.
Gosh.
And then one day on the Grand Canal, just going from one place to another, I saw a small, little motorboat with a coffin. And of course, Venice was going through its ordinary life, and of course that made me think about a number of things. But one was that there's a famous play in the, I think, early 17th century, when Titian was at the end of his life, and he was painting a very beautiful Pietà, which is in the Accademia Museum.
Yes.
And
I know it well. Yes, yeah.
Yeah, and it's a very beautiful. It looks like a piece of carving. It looks actually it's made from stone. And there's a tiny little. He made a tiny little portrait of himself and his son, right in the bottom right-hand corner. And of course, his son died of the plague, but Titian couldn't have a proper funeral because it didn't want to have it during the plague. And then there was Thomas Mann writing Death in Venice, which is really all about cholera, as well as about same-sex desire and all that. So I was thinking about all those questions, that Venice had been so open to pestilence, because it was a big trading city. It had connection to the East, and Thomas Mann has a big description of where exactly the cholera had come from in down in India and Persia and Afghanistan, and those places that suggested to him a sort of where disease might come from, a sort of Orientalism of a certain sort. And but it was I realized that I would never see this again, and that no one else would see it, what Venice is like when it's empty.
Right, yeah.
And it may never be empty again.
No, indeed. I mean, that Titian Pietà is a staggering, visceral kind of painting, isn't it?
It's also because often that image of the Pietà is a comforting one, that she, that the suffering is all over and she sort of can hold his dead body. But that one, there's a sense of stark grief, of shock, of in the work. And he was very old when he made it, and outside his window, people were dying and in the streets.
I seem to remember as well, that was his favourite son that died in the plague. Yeah. He had another son who was like the usual son of a celebrity who sold all his drawings, I think, and just gambled and drunk it away, it's like some sort of parable somehow.
Yeah.
And that silence, is it also a kind of your own kind of intimations of mortality in the poem?
No, it wasn't as much that intimations of mortality as much as the sort of noise of the world that we've learned to live with, the sort of day-to-day business of what boats sound like, what people, all of it gone, and just able to listen to the, I suppose, what Derek Mahon has a lovely phrase. He calls it the soft roar of the world.
Oh, yeah.
And you see, in Venice, there are really no trees much, so there's no wind in the trees, and so you're listening to pigeon sound or footfall sound, but not much.
We better start drawing this to a close, but I really want to finish with Because the Night, which is I think, is it the final poem of the collection?
It is, yeah.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
Which, of course, reminded me of your novel. At least the title, "The Story of the Night." One of the novels that I've loved, along with others. But let's hear you read it, and then perhaps finish by saying a little bit about "Because the Night."
Because the night, not sleeping, and then a night's hard sleep, waking, unsure which room I'm in. My old friend, gone 2 years, was there last night, sitting at a table, fully himself. I know he is dead. Even in the dream, I knew this, and I talked to him about ordinary things, not how he died or where he is. Sometimes my mother floats in, or my brothers, less often my father, who died long before they did. And then the old room in Hatch Street, or the top floor of number 2 Harker Terrace, where I lived years back, come as though I still keep stuff in them, but have stopped paying the rent and must sneak in and out because someone is under orders to waylay me. Soon I will have to try and rescue books and clothes, get back the music that echoes here, especially on nights when you snore and I move into the study and sleep in the daybed. And when I wake, I have no clue where I am, what bed this is, but I will get up and find you, alive, real, now. And the morning starts, emails, the newspaper. I carry the night all day there, a flight path, a way through.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering whether you might...
It's a sort of love poem, in a way, but, about waking in the morning, there being someone else there. And, it's the whole business of, I don't know if you've ever been with anyone who snores, but the whole moving in, and then thinking, where could I possibly be now? But it is that whole business of getting one of those night sleeps. It's long, and sleep is deep, and things come to you that have come before, but in a very intense way. And the dream is actually quite easy to, there's nothing hard to understand in it. And so that's, and, I was trying to be, just the thing is to try and be accurate, that, my mother and my brothers come more often than my father because he died before they did. So it's as though, he sort of faded further, and that's a difficult truth, that's what happens.
Yes, that's right. Yes, that's right. And did you choose this to be the final poem of the collection?
No, John McAuliffe did, and I just loved I suppose I enjoyed the attention, but I also enjoyed the fact that he really put a lot of thought into it. And that, and when he said this at the end, I thought, well, this guy's really, really been thinking.
Right, yeah.
And it's really,
right, isn't it?
It's so great to have an editor who does that sort of thinking.
But say a little bit more to finish about what do you mean by I carry the night all day, though, a flight path, a way through?
I mean that those dreams of people who've died, or of houses I lived in, the whole sense of a sort of a past, that's, of the past, that you sort of need to do that to get that back where it's vivid for a while. And then in the day, you actually have bits of it still come to you as though you're living with it. And it sort of seems a sort of necessary thing to do in order to cope. So you carry the night with you in the day. I mean, it's obvious that you carry the day with you in the night because you often dream about things that are on your mind. But what if it was the other way around, where the actual dreaming itself made its way in strange ways into your day, into your ordinary thinking life, into your conscious life? So that's the idea.
That's wonderful.
But also, it's also a language thing. I liked the idea of putting though and through at the end of lines, just beside it. There's some though and through, I don't know, through completing though beginning the sound, and through sort of completing the sound, some idea like that as well. I mean, through, though being the dream word and through being the daytime word.
Yes, that's right. And I wanted to sort of finish by, asking you that rather grand question. We started with you and poetry, and we started with, in my, I always hear your mother reciting poetry in my mind when you talk about it. Poetry doesn't seem to be much, I can't imagine many people discovering Wallace Stevens now like your mother did and following that up. perhaps that's not true, but it feels like it's a diminishing audience. What can poetry offer people? What's it's offered you, and what do you think it can still offer? And I mean people like Stevens and any of those names that we've all we love.
Derek Mann has a famous poem called "A Disused Shed in County Wexford," and the first line of it is, "Even now there are places where a thought might grow," and I think it's even now there are places where a poem could matter, and you don't know where they are, you don't know where they're ever going to be. But in America, it's strange that a figure like Emily Dickinson, I think, has quite a lot of power in America. So does Walt Whitman, and this is sometimes among ordinary people who will take those poets, Whitman and Dickinson, as part of their heritage, in the same way as in Ireland, you would take Yeats or Heaney or Ivan Boland as part of your heritage. And there's a funny thing in England, the way you guys have had poet laureates in recent years that have really spoken to people, that there's a sense of Simon Armitage and his work, but his presence in the landscape. Yeah. And it was the same with Ted Hughes, and it was certainly the same with Caroline Duffy, and it was the same with Andrew Motion, that there were people who stood for something, and their poetry stood for something, and it wasn't as though it was a part. I think it's been especially true with Ted Hughes and Caroline and Simon, that they are people who stand for something spiritual and that matters, and that people, including people who mightn't read much poetry, would have a notion that matters, and they might know it matters if they want a poem for a funeral, or they want a poem for a wedding, or there's some other ritual they want it for. So I don't think it's that far from people, and I think that if you said to people, is there a poem that matters to you? Often you find, yeah, there is a poem that matters. So I don't feel that in a minority. I think it's it's just that maybe it isn't brought to the fore all the time. But it's fine. I mean, really, let's not complain.
Yes, indeed. That's a really great place to finish. Let's not complain. Something that would be a mantra for us all into the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really good to see you.
It was a real pleasure talking to you. I hope I can see you again soon.
Yes, likewise.
Okay. Thank
See
you.
you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye bye.